Putting down the now empty watering can, Chiaki smiled at the pansies in satisfaction. The flowers she and Kamakura-kun had planted together had bloomed the very day Enoshima was defeated, as if they knew it was a day worth celebrating. Even the withered sakura trees looked a bit less skeletal, and the regular ones were defiantly, vibrantly green. Rising from her kneeling position, she cracked out her back.
Hard to believe it's been a year.
This time last year, she hadn't been able to even lift her arm. And now she was able to live again. All the things she'd taken for granted before, things like walking and eating, were back in her power. Even the gap between herself and Kamakura-kun in video games had been growing smaller, slowly but surely. The sound of a sheet snapping out caught her ear, and she glanced at the other end of the yard, where Kamakura-kun was hanging up laundry. Involuntarily, she smiled again. She was glad she'd met him, not just because he'd saved her life, but because she'd become a better person from knowing him. Less naive. People in power weren't always benevolent or trustworthy, the good guys didn't always win, and the bad guys' legacies continued past their defeat. Hoping for the best sometimes wasn't enough, and you had better be prepared to work and work and work when it wasn't. Idealism wasn't foolish, of course not, just something exercised with caution. Something she'd failed to grasp before and almost died because of. But she had the chance to do differently now. Approaching him, she called out,
Hey, Kamakura-kun?
He turned, eyebrows marginally lifting in silent inquiry. A breeze picked up, lifting his hair and blowing it gently away from his face. And for a moment, Chiaki slowed, eyes drifting across his features, admiring the line of his jaw and tallness of his nose. If she looked closely enough, she could make out a thin ring of paler red in his ruby irises, almost like a targeting symbol. It was fitting, considering that recently she felt caught in crosshairs whenever she met his gaze. He really was handsome. She'd always known so in a distant way, but hadn't really acknowledged it. It didn't feel fair when she knew part of the reason she thought so was because of her feelings for Hinata-kun. But more and more often, she found the thought invading her mind, and not because of Hinata-kun. And lately, there'd been a feeling fluttering delicately in her chest. A hesitant, not so little feeling that she'd been slowly growing aware of. When it had come into existence, she didn't know, but it had been born sometime in between the therapies and the gaming and the countless other things they did together. It was new and a bit frightening, complicated, but still easily condensed into a single thought.
I think I like him.
Like wasn't the right word, she knew. Like was too weak and immature. Like made her think of schoolyard crushes and 10-year-old children and notes from secret admirers. But like was the word she was most comfortable using right now, so like it was. Because if she was falling for Kamakura-kun, it was nothing like falling for Hinata-kun. With Hinata-kun, it had been fast and easy, as natural as breathing, a flurry of soaring feelings tempered by nervous excitement. With Kamakura-kun, it was more like floating on the ocean, deceptively comforting and slow, letting the waves gently bob you away until you looked around and realized you'd lost sight of the shore. Just so different, it left her out of her depth, and like helped it seem less dizzying. And then there were other questions, beyond the question of whether he returned her feelings or not. Questions like, could she expect him to be ready for that kind of relationship when even basic intimacy was strange to him? More importantly, could she expect herself to be ready? She didn't think she was. Not right now. She didn't know how to be a girlfriend. She'd have no idea what she was doing, and Kamakura-kun's route was probably hard mode. She just wasn't emotionally prepared for it. Right now, both a rejection and an acceptance scared her. So until she was at a point where neither did, she wouldn't confess. And until then, there were other things Chiaki needed to do.
I want to go to the Future Foundation.
She told him.
I have to do something to help the world rebuild and help my friends. I think I'm well enough for that now.
He didn't look as if her declaration surprised him. He only gave her a considering look and finally said, I also believe you have reached a suitable condition for your physical and mental health. However, a test would still be wise. If you show exemplary signs of recovery, I will consider you fit to leave my care.
Thanks.
Chiaki hesitated. The question she dreaded the most hung like a black shadow over her mind, weighing down the air between them.
I need to ask it. What will you do after?
I will stay nearby for a time to ensure your integration into the Foundation is a smooth one. After, I suppose I will wander. She licked her lips.
You don't have to go. You could stay.
He did not answer for a long moment. That is not possible. I will eventually need to concentrate my efforts on bringing your friends to the Neo World program. Kamakura-kun fixed her with a hard stare. Understand, Nanami, that I am not being altruistic. I am not saving your friends. I am only giving them the chance to be saved, and I am doing it because I get something out of it.
What's that?
An answer. He said cryptically, and she knew he would say no more. Chiaki nodded, quiet and solemn. She knew this was in his character. He was a neutral force, not a good one, but not an evil one either.
Even still, I think I like him. Okay, I understand. Will you stay in touch?
Some of the hardness in his face smoothed out. For as long as I am able. She passed the test, but they did not leave immediately. They needed several days to get everything sorted out. Future Foundation policy was that all potential employees go to the 3rd Division for human resourcing. That meant moving to a new city, finding a new place to live. And, for Chiaki, finding a new identity. She hadn't needed to ask why when Kamakura-kun told her. She'd understood. Because the world thought Nanami Chiaki had died during the parade, and that Kamakura Izuru was a remnant of despair. If it was known that a supposed remnant had saved her life, and she'd then lived with him for a year, suspicion would fall on her. The Future Foundation's vice chairman was aggressively anti-despair, and just because they were doing good didn't mean she could expect to be treated kindly if any of the people in charge found out about her relationship with Kamakura-kun. At best, she'd be imprisoned and interrogated about him. At worst, outright executed. So, Kamakura-kun fabricated documents, birth certificates, school records, and citizenships. Invented an entire history out of thin air. Made her memorize it until she could recite it as well as her real history. It was odd, disassociative in a way. It felt like she was existing separate from her real identity. But she told herself to think of it like an RPG. She was just slipping into the shoes of another character for now, and once it was safe, whenever that may come, she'd take them off. Chiaki zipped up her last bag and looked around her now empty bedroom. It was strange to be leaving. This place had been her sanctuary, her home, for a year. She wondered what would happen to it. She didn't know whether Kamakura-kun had sold it, or even if he'd properly bought it in the first place. Maybe someone else would come along and make it their home. Maybe it'd just sit here and collect dust, and eventually be overgrown with weeds. The thought made her sad, and she patted the wall as if in apology. Nanami? Kamakura-kun was in the doorway, watching her. He must have just finished the last of the packing. There was still a bit of soil on his sleeves from transplanting the pansies into pots. Ignoring how her heart skipped at the way he said her name, Chiaki turned and smiled at him, hefting the bags.
I'm ready.
The first time Nanami Chiaki crossed the threshold of this sanctuary, she'd been vegetative and had to be carried through the front door. The last time Nanami Chiaki crossed the threshold of this sanctuary, it was on her own 2 feet. End of Chapter 15. Author's note. No, Chiaki will not be the 13th Division leader. I'm just going to say that right now. It would just be too difficult to justify, with Chisa also a division leader. Toss in the whole point of faking an identity being staying unnoticed, and it just becomes impossible. But hey, at least she's finally recognizing her feelings. So, just for fun, I decided to look up the meaning of the flowers I had Chiaki and Izuru plant, and it turns out pansies mean remembrance. I wish I could say that symbolism was intentional on my part, but it wasn't. I picked out significant flowers completely by accident. It was such an awesome coincidence, I just had to share.